Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the chilling tale of one of history's most infamous figures, Adolf Hitler. Picture this, a frail, disheveled young man walking through the streets of Vienna, with nothing but his dreams of power and hatred burning in his heart. That was the beginning of a journey that would not only shape the future of a nation, but plunge the world into one of its darkest chapters. You probably won't survive this one without a few shivers down your spine, but hey, that's history for you, right? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're watching from and the time in your local time zone. Curious to know how far and wide this journey travels. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small Austrian town. Little did the world know, this seemingly ordinary birth would eventually ignite a tempest of unimaginable horror. Hitler's early life was far from the dramatic tale we know today. Raised in a strict household, his father, Alois Hitler, was domineering and often harsh, while his mother, Clara, was a source of comfort in his otherwise tumultuous youth. This parental dynamic would leave scars, but it wasn't the source of his future wrath. Historians still argue whether the intense relationship with his father played a pivotal role in shaping Hitler's tyrannical tendencies, or if it was merely one chapter in a complex psychological evolution. At age 18, Hitler moved to Vienna with big dreams of becoming a painter. Yet, his artistic aspirations were crushed when he was rejected twice from the Academy of Fine Arts. Instead of the future he imagined, Hitler found himself on the streets, living a hand-to-mouth existence. It was in this period of failure and frustration that his hatred for Jews and other minorities began to take root. While Vienna in the early 1900s was a place of artistic and intellectual ferment, it was also a hotbed of anti-Semitic rhetoric. Historians often point to these early years as the foundational period where Hitler's deep-seated racial hatred blossomed. Whether this exposure to anti-Semitic ideas was coincidental or transformative is still a subject of debate. Despite his initial misfortunes, it was in Vienna that Hitler became enamored with the idea of a powerful, ethnically pure German state. He soaked up nationalist and anti-Semitic literature like a sponge, and it was here that his dangerous ideological seed was planted. By the time he left Vienna, the embers of his Nazi vision were smoldering quietly, waiting for the right moment to ignite. In 1913, Hitler moved to Munich, Germany. Little did the world know, this city would soon become the breeding ground for one of history's most destructive political movements. At this point, Hitler's life was still marked by personal failure. He was living in poverty, dependent on welfare, and still nursing his artistic dreams. But history was about to take a turn. The First World War was raging across Europe, and Hitler, like many others, believed it was his moment to prove himself. Historians often debate how much the experience of World War I shaped Hitler's extreme worldview. What we do know is that the war served as a crucible in which his feelings of anger, frustration, and powerlessness were fused into a single, consuming ideology. Serving as a soldier in the Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment 16, Hitler was exposed to the horrors of war, witnessing the destruction of life and the trauma of battle. A pivotal moment in his life occurred when he was injured in a mustard gas attack, temporarily blinding him. As he recuperated in a military hospital, Hitler would have had time to reflect on his failure to achieve personal glory. The seeds of his obsession with nationalistic power, revenge, and racial purity were beginning to bloom. The war's end, however, would be the true catalyst for Hitler's rise. Germany was defeated, and the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed humiliating terms on the nation. The treaty created a sense of betrayal among Germans, fueling resentment that Hitler would later manipulate to his advantage. Historians still debate whether Hitler genuinely believed that Germany had been stabbed in the back, or if he simply used this sentiment to gain a following. Regardless, the stage was set. Hitler was now not just a failed artist, but a man with a new grand vision, the restoration of German pride, and a quest for vengeance against those he deemed responsible for his country's defeat. For the next few years, Hitler's ideology evolved, and he began to form the core beliefs that would fuel the Nazi movement. He joined the German Workers' Party, which would eventually become the Nazi Party. His powerful oratory skills and ability to tap into the frustrations of the German people made him a rising star in a country ravaged by war and economic instability. Hitler began to build his political empire by offering a simple solution to the chaos surrounding him: powerful Germany, led by a single, unchallenged Führer, free from the constraints of foreign influence and populated by an ethnically pure master race. The darkness of Hitler's vision was now beginning to manifest in concrete political ideology. His beliefs in racial superiority, the need for an aggressive foreign policy, and the supremacy of the German state began to take shape. Yet, at this stage, Hitler's political journey was still very much in its infancy. Few could have predicted just how far his path would take him or the devastation it would bring to the world. As we move forward, you'll discover how Hitler's early ideology began to solidify, how he would manipulate propaganda, and how he would eventually rise to power in a way that would leave the world reeling. Remember, it's often the moments of personal failure and quiet resentment that give rise to the greatest storms of history. The flames of Adolf Hitler's ambition were about to be stoked further. The experience of World War I had left deep scars on both the man and the nation. Germany was defeated, humiliated, and broken by the Treaty of Versailles. And it was this very sense of national shame that Hitler would soon weaponize. But what really marked this period in Hitler's life was the shift from a disillusioned soldier to a man with a singular vision of power. In the wake of Germany's collapse, Hitler's quest for revenge and glory had found fertile ground. Historians still argue over whether Hitler's vision was purely a reaction to the immediate aftermath of the war, or if it was part of a deeper, long-standing ideological obsession. What's clear, however, is that by the early 1920s, Hitler had found his political voice. He wasn't just some disaffected veteran. He was a man who saw an opportunity to capitalize on the discontent and confusion that gripped Germany, and he was ready to exploit it in the most ruthless ways imaginable. In 1919, Hitler joined the German Workers' Party, a tiny nationalist political group with just a few dozen members. His public speaking skills quickly turned heads, and by 1920, Hitler had become the party's chief spokesperson. It was in this environment that he began to sharpen his anti-Semitic rhetoric, blaming Jews, Marxists, and other undesirable groups for Germany's downfall. But even as he embraced these vile ideas, Hitler began to formulate a political platform. The program would soon become the foundation of his ideology, a belief system that would be both populist and utterly dangerous. It was simple. Germany needed to rid itself of Jews, expand its territory, and restore its military strength. Historians often note how Hitler's rhetoric could be eerily persuasive. He understood the power of fear, frustration, and resentment. And, of course, he knew how to play to the masses. He didn't just speak to the elites or intellectuals. He spoke to the common man, to those who had lost everything after the war. He promised them strength, pride, and a return to glory. In his speeches, Hitler tapped into the deep well of German nationalism, transforming it into a force that would sweep the nation and beyond. But it wasn't just the power of words that made Hitler a rising force. It was his growing ability to organize and manipulate. The failed beer hall putsch of 1923 would prove to be an important lesson for Hitler. After his arrest for attempting to overthrow the Bavarian government, Hitler wrote his manifesto, Mein Kampf, in prison. This would be his blueprint, a mix of raw ambition, racial hatred, and a twisted vision of Germany's future. Mein Kampf outlined his disdain for the Jews, his belief in the need for Lebensraum, living space, for the German people, and his desire to eradicate the Treaty of Versailles. The book, though widely ignored at first, became the foundation for Nazi ideology. What makes Mein Kampf so chilling is its banality. It's easy to dismiss Hitler's later rise as the result of some complex conspiracy, but in many ways, it was his ability to articulate deeply hateful ideas in a simple, direct manner that resonated with so many. The language in Mein Kampf is not intellectual or difficult to understand. It's plain, angry, and raw. And for a nation that had been stripped of its pride and was seeking direction, it was just the kind of message that could incite fervor. But as Hitler's political stock rose, so did the resistance. The early 1920s were a time of instability for the Nazi Party. Hitler was continually thwarted by his own inability to consolidate real power. It wasn't until the Great Depression of 1929, which sent Germany into economic freefall, that the Nazi Party began to gather real traction. The economic crisis created a fertile ground for Hitler's message. As unemployment soared and poverty spread, Germans turned to the extreme right for answers. Hitler's promise of a restored economy, national pride, and military might begin to resonate with more and more people. Historians often debate whether Hitler would have been able to seize power without the Depression. It's likely that his rise was a perfect storm of personal ambition, public discontent, and social unrest. But regardless of the circumstances, Hitler had found his moment. By the early 1930s, the Nazi Party had transformed from a fringe group into one of the most influential political forces in Germany. Hitler had succeeded in weaving together an ideology of fear, resentment, and hate, and now he was ready to take the next step, seizing power. In 1932, Hitler ran for president of Germany. Though he lost the election to Paul von Hindenburg, his second-place finish revealed just how far his influence had grown. The Nazi Party was now the largest party in the Reichstag, the German parliament. But despite this success, Hitler was still unable to gain the presidency. He knew, however, that all he needed was a single opportunity to secure his ultimate goal, becoming Führer of Germany. Historians continue to argue over the role that elite political maneuvering played in Hitler's rise. Was it his ability to make deals with powerful figures in German society that ultimately paved the way for his appointment as chancellor, or was it the sheer power of his political movement? It's likely a combination of both. But on January 30th, 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. The stage was set for the final act of his political journey, a journey that would lead not just to the rise of Nazi Germany, but to the destruction of Europe. In the coming sections, we'll dive into the mechanisms Hitler used to solidify his grip on power, the terrifying effectiveness of Nazi propaganda, and the series of events that would lead to the creation of the Third Reich. You'll witness the chilling rise of a man who, despite his early failures, would go on to reshape the world in the most catastrophic way possible. As Hitler's grip on Germany tightened, the true scale of his vision began to take shape. By 1933, he had ascended to the position of chancellor, but his work had only just begun. The Nazis were no longer just a political party. They were the engine of a brutal new world order, built on hatred, nationalism, and the complete subjugation of anyone who did not fit Hitler's narrow vision of racial purity. But how did he go from being an elected leader to a dictator with absolute control? The answer lies in his ability to exploit fear, manipulate the system, and master the art of propaganda. Historians often debate whether Hitler's rise to power was the result of a deliberate strategy or sheer opportunism. What we do know is that he used every opportunity to build his strength, starting with the Reichstag fire in February 1933. The Reichstag, Germany's parliament building, was set ablaze under mysterious circumstances. Hitler wasted no time in using this event to his advantage. He blamed the fire on communist agitators, stirring up fear of a supposed left-wing coup. The fire, whether intentionally started by Nazi operatives or not, became a perfect excuse for Hitler to push through the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended civil liberties and allowed for the arrest of political opponents. Historians still argue whether the Nazis orchestrated the fire to create this pretext, or whether it was simply a happy accident for their political ambitions. With the Reichstag fire decree in place, Hitler was granted sweeping powers to suppress opposition, silence dissent, and silence the press. But that wasn't enough. He needed more. Hitler pushed for the Enabling Act, which passed on March 23, 1933, effectively giving him dictatorial powers. This law allowed Hitler to pass laws without the approval of the Reichstag, sidelining any democratic processes that remained. And with that, the Weimar Republic, the last shred of democracy in Germany, was dead. Hitler was now free to reshape the country in his own image. Historians still argue whether the Enabling Act was a genuine legal process or a blatant coup. Some suggest that Hitler's manipulation of the Reichstag and the pressure exerted on key political figures led to the act's passage, while others contend that the act was the culmination of a brilliant political strategy that relied on careful manipulation of both public sentiment and the existing political system. Regardless of the method, the result was the same. Hitler was in control. With power now firmly in his hands, Hitler began dismantling the democratic structures of Germany. The Nazi Party was the only legal political organization, and all opposition parties were outlawed. Trade unions were destroyed, and the media was brought under strict Nazi control. The police, the army, and the civil service were purged of anyone deemed disloyal, and those who remained were expected to pledge absolute allegiance to Hitler and the state. In just a few short months, Hitler had transformed Germany from a fledgling democracy into a brutal dictatorship. Historians often point to this period as the moment when Hitler's ability to manipulate political institutions reached its peak. But the true force behind his success lay in his mastery of propaganda. The role of propaganda in Hitler's rise cannot be overstated. His propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, was a master manipulator of the masses, using every medium available to spread Nazi ideology. Posters, films, radio broadcasts, and rallies were all used to drum up support for Hitler's vision. The infamous Nuremberg rallies, for example, were not just political gatherings. They were spectacles designed to create a sense of unity, power, and awe. The scale and theatricality of these events were designed to overwhelm the senses and leave an indelible impression on those who attended. Historians still debate the extent to which these rallies were effective in shaping public opinion. Some argue that they were little more than grandiose displays of power, while others believe they were critical in maintaining Nazi control over the populace. What is undeniable, however, is the effectiveness of Nazi propaganda in shaping public perceptions of Hitler and the regime. Goebbels understood the importance of repetition and emotional appeal. His ministry churned out a steady stream of messages that glorified Hitler, demonized Jews and other minorities, and created a sense of national unity through fear and hate. The Nazis exploited the cultural and economic frustrations of the German people, using propaganda to convince them that their problems could be solved by a powerful, charismatic leader like Hitler. And it worked. Hitler's popularity soared, and the Nazis solidified their grip on power. But the propaganda didn't just serve to unite Germans behind Hitler's vision. It also laid the groundwork for the policies that would follow. Anti-Semitism, which had been a fringe belief, was now front and center in Nazi ideology. Hitler's speeches and propaganda blamed Jews for Germany's defeat in World War I, for the country's economic troubles, and for the moral decay he believed was plaguing the nation. The Nazis were quick to turn this hatred into policy, implementing laws that restricted the rights of Jews and other minorities, stripping them of their citizenship, and creating a legal framework for their eventual persecution. Historians often debate the origins of Hitler's anti-Semitic beliefs. Some suggest that they were the result of his exposure to anti-Semitic literature in Vienna, while others argue that they were influenced by the broader political climate of post-World War I Germany. What is clear, however, is that Hitler's anti-Semitism was not just a personal prejudice. It was a cornerstone of Nazi ideology. And as the years went on, this hatred would become the driving force behind some of the most horrific acts in human history. The use of propaganda was only one tool in Hitler's arsenal. To fully consolidate his power, he needed to eliminate any potential threats to his authority. The Night of the Long Knives, in June 1934, was one of the most infamous purges in Nazi history. The SA, or brown shirts, had been instrumental in helping Hitler rise to power, but had become a threat to his control as their leader, Ernst Röhm, sought to expand their influence. Fearing that Röhm's growing power could undermine his own, Hitler ordered the execution of Röhm and hundreds of other SA members. The purge eliminated a key rival faction within the Nazi Party and sent a clear message to anyone who might challenge Hitler's leadership. Historians still debate whether Hitler had always planned the purge or whether it was a response to the increasing pressure from the military and other factions within the party. Either way, the Night of the Long Knives cemented Hitler's control over both the Nazi Party and the country at large. By the end of 1934, Hitler had consolidated his power to an extent few could have imagined. Germany was no longer a democracy. It was a fascist state, controlled entirely by one man. The laws, the military, and the media all served the will of Adolf Hitler. But the true test was still to come. In the following years, Hitler would begin to implement his dangerous expansionist policies, which would lead to the outbreak of World War II. But for now, Hitler's absolute power was secure, and the world would soon begin to feel the full weight of his twisted vision for the future. With Hitler now firmly in control of Germany, the next stage of his plan was set in motion: the creation of a totalitarian state and the pursuit of an aggressive foreign policy. This was a period where Hitler's vision for a racially pure, expansive German empire began to take shape in more concrete terms. But as his power expanded, so did his paranoia and his contempt for anyone who threatened his authority or his plans. And while many Germans rallied behind him, believing in his promises of national greatness, the world outside was beginning to wake up to the storm that was brewing. Hitler's expansionist goals were laid out clearly in his book Mein Kampf, where he spoke of the need for Lebensraum, living space for the German people. The idea was simple yet terrifying. Germany needed to expand eastward, conquering land from the Soviet Union and other countries to accommodate its growing population and to assert its dominance in Europe. Historians still debate the full extent of Hitler's territorial ambitions, whether he envisioned the conquest of all of Europe or simply the lands to the east. Regardless, the key idea was clear: Germany's power and influence had to be unchallenged, and the only way to achieve this was through force. In the early years of his reign, Hitler sought to rearm Germany, violating the Treaty of Versailles that had placed severe restrictions on the country's military after World War I. The Nazis began building up the Wehrmacht, the German military, and modernizing it for war. By 1936, Germany had reoccupied the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone, in direct defiance of the treaty. The world, still reeling from the Great Depression and World War I, did nothing to stop him. This moment is often seen by historians as the beginning of the policy of appeasement, the idea that if Hitler was given small concessions, he might be satisfied and stop expanding. This belief, tragically, would be proven wrong. In 1938, Hitler moved to annex Austria, a goal he had long harbored. The Anschluss, as it was called, was a largely bloodless operation, with little resistance from Austria or the international community. Hitler's popularity among the Austrian population, many of whom had long been sympathetic to his nationalist cause, made the annexation seem like a natural extension of German unity. But for the rest of Europe, this was a clear sign that Hitler was not content with merely regaining lost territory. He wanted to reshape the entire map of Europe. Historians still argue about whether the appeasement strategy was born from fear, complacency, or sheer misjudgment. What is certain is that by the time Hitler's troops marched into Austria, many had already decided to let him have his way. However, Hitler's next move would be far more controversial and would push Europe to the brink of war. In September 1938, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a large ethnic German population, be ceded to Germany. The Munich Agreement, signed by Britain, France, Italy, and Germany, allowed Hitler to annex the region in exchange for a promise of no further territorial expansion. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously returned to England, declaring that the agreement had brought peace for our time. Historians still argue whether Chamberlain's decision was a diplomatic triumph or a catastrophic misstep. But one thing is clear: Hitler's appetite for expansion was far from satisfied, and the Munich Agreement only emboldened him. By March 1939, just months after the Munich Agreement, Hitler broke his promise and invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. This was the moment when even the most ardent appeasers could no longer deny the threat posed by Nazi Germany. The world watched in horror as Hitler continued his march across Europe, making it clear that his ambitions knew no bounds. Historians debate whether this was the moment that triggered World War II, or if the war was inevitable after years of unchecked aggression. Either way, Hitler had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The next key moment came in August 1939, when Hitler signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union. This non-aggression treaty shocked the world, as it effectively ensured that Germany would not have to fight a two-front war. Historians continue to question why Hitler made this pact. Some argue that it was a tactical move to secure his eastern border before invading Poland, while others believe that Hitler may have thought the Soviet Union was too weak to pose a real threat. Either way, the pact sealed the fate of Europe. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, setting off a chain reaction that would result in the outbreak of World War II. As Germany moved into Poland, the world reacted swiftly. Britain and France declared war on Germany, but the rest of Europe was largely passive, either unwilling or unable to stop Hitler's march. This initial success in Poland, along with rapid victories in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands in 1940, made it clear that Hitler's ambitions were not only real, they were dangerous. But as the war dragged on, the cracks in Nazi ideology and Hitler's own leadership began to show. Hitler's invasion of Poland marked the beginning of the most devastating war in history. And yet, as we'll see in later sections, it wasn't just his military conquest that defined his rule. It was the sheer scale of the horrors he unleashed upon the world. As Germany conquered more territory, the true nature of Hitler's vision became terrifyingly clear: a world reshaped by force, where entire populations were enslaved, exterminated, or otherwise erased from existence. Historians have spent decades trying to understand how one man could orchestrate such a cataclysmic series of events. Some suggest that Hitler was simply a madman, driven by an unchecked lust for power. Others argue that he was a product of his time, an opportunist who exploited a world in chaos. The answer, as always, is likely more complicated. But one thing remains certain: Hitler's rise to power and his subsequent conquest of Europe would change the course of history forever. In the next sections, we'll take a closer look at how Hitler's policies of racial purity and his war on Jews and other minorities led to the horrors of the Holocaust. We'll explore how his obsession with territorial expansion ultimately brought Germany to ruin, and how his failures in the later years of the war hastened his downfall. The war, however, was only part of the story. It was Hitler's vision of the future that left an indelible mark on history, and that's where we'll continue next. As Nazi Germany continued its march across Europe, Hitler's vision of a racially pure, hegemonic empire took a terrifying and systematic form. But it wasn't just about expanding territory and imposing power through military might. His conquest was also about the complete annihilation of anyone deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. Central to this vision was the Holocaust, a genocide of unimaginable scale, born from a deeply twisted vision of racial purity and the obsession with the Jewish question. Historians have spent decades analyzing how Hitler's anti-Semitism morphed from hateful rhetoric to systematic violence. Was it the economic collapse of the Weimar Republic that fueled his rage? Or was his anti-Semitism something deeper, almost pathological? Many scholars suggest that Hitler's hatred for Jews was not simply a product of the times, but obsession he nurtured throughout his adult life. The rise of the Nazi Party gave him the platform to act on these dark ideas, turning rhetoric into brutal policy. In the early years of Hitler's rule, anti-Semitic laws were introduced gradually. The Nuremberg Laws, passed in 1935, stripped Jews of their German citizenship, outlawed marriages between Jews and non-Jews, and limited their ability to work in various professions. These laws served as the precursor to the horrifying campaign of extermination that would follow. The Nazis' first step was to isolate Jews socially, politically, and economically. For a time, the Nazi Party appeared to be content with what some historians call nonviolent anti-Semitism, encouraging social exclusion, boycotts, and marginalization. But this was only the beginning. As the war escalated and the Nazi war machine expanded, Hitler's policies became more radical and violent. In 1941, as the German army invaded the Soviet Union, the final solution, the systematic extermination of the Jewish people, was set into motion. The war on the Eastern Front exposed millions of Jews to Nazi brutality. Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, followed the German army into conquered territories, rounding up Jews, communists, and other targeted groups and shooting them in mass executions. Historians are still grappling with the origins and scale of the Einsatzgruppen operations, but what is clear is that the genocidal violence was widespread and increasingly methodical. Yet, it wasn't until 1942 that the Nazis fully committed to the creation of extermination camps designed specifically for mass murder. The most infamous of these was Auschwitz, located in occupied Poland, which became the heart of the Nazi death machine. The scale of the killing in Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and other camps was unfathomable. Millions were sent to these camps, where they were either gassed, starved, worked to death, or subjected to horrific medical experiments. The Nazis developed a system of industrialized death. Gassing chambers and crematoriums were built to efficiently carry out the mass murder of Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, Polish and Soviet prisoners of war, and others who were seen as racially inferior or unworthy of life. The logistics of this mass extermination were terrifyingly precise. Jews were transported in overcrowded trains from ghettos and camps to the death camps, where they were either immediately murdered or forced into slave labor until they died from exhaustion. Some historians point out that the efficiency with which the Nazis carried out this genocide was both horrifying and a testament to the bureaucratic and organizational capacity of the Nazi state. These extermination efforts didn't just target Jews. They also included Romani people, disabled individuals, LGBTQ+ people, and other minorities. The Nazis considered these groups racially inferior, and Hitler's vision of a pure Aryan race extended to wiping them off the map. But even within the Nazi regime, the question of the final solution was controversial. Historians argue whether Hitler personally ordered the extermination of the Jews or whether it was a decision made by his subordinates, with him merely turning a blind eye. Some argue that the decision to systematically murder millions was made in a top-down fashion, with Hitler giving his consent in subtle ways but never issuing a direct order. Others suggest that his rhetoric and obsession with a Jew-free Europe created the conditions where this genocide became a bureaucratic reality. Regardless, it's clear that Hitler's hatred for Jews was not just ideological. It was institutionalized, organized, and transformed into an industrial-scale genocide. The scale of the Holocaust is almost beyond comprehension. 6 million Jews were murdered, along with millions of others. Entire families, communities, and cultures were wiped out. It is often said that the Holocaust was one of the greatest atrocities in human history, and it is hard to argue otherwise. The emotional, psychological, and physical scars left by the Holocaust would last for generations. The horror of these events left an indelible mark on history and would forever alter the course of post-war Europe. But even as Nazi Germany's military victories in the early years of World War II fueled Hitler's delusions of grandeur, cracks were beginning to form in the regime. His leadership, which had initially seemed brilliant and decisive, began to falter as the tide of war turned. By the time Hitler had launched his invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, things began to spiral out of control. The initial blitzkrieg tactics that had so successfully conquered Poland, France, and other European nations had begun to falter in the cold, vast expanses of the Soviet Union. The battle for Stalingrad, which would become one of the turning points of the war, showed that the Germans were not invincible. The Soviet forces, with the help of the harsh winter, stopped the Nazi advance, and Hitler's dream of a quick and decisive victory in the East was dashed. The losses at Stalingrad and subsequent defeats on the Eastern Front were not just military setbacks for Hitler, they were psychological blows. His belief in Germany's destiny, in his ability to lead his people to greatness, was starting to crumble. As the war in the East turned increasingly disastrous, Hitler's paranoia deepened, and he became more and more isolated from reality. He ignored his generals, who were urging for retreat and a strategic withdrawal. Historians often debate whether this was a sign of his genius in staying true to his vision, or whether it was evidence of his dangerous delusion and obsession with victory at any cost. But the more Hitler clung to his plans, the more disastrous the consequences became. As the war dragged on and defeat loomed ever closer, Hitler's focus turned from military strategy to desperate attempts to hold onto the ideals that had brought him to power. His obsession with the purity of the Aryan race led to a continued campaign of destruction, both on the battlefield and in the concentration camps. As the Allies closed in on Germany from both the East and West, Hitler's regime, once so powerful and promising, was crumbling under the weight of its own atrocities. As the war raged on and the end loomed ever closer, Hitler's mental state deteriorated. The early successes of Nazi Germany, built on a mix of military genius and ruthless ideology, had turned to ashes. The once brilliant tactician now seemed like a man trapped in a labyrinth of his own delusions. His early victories in Europe were distant memories, and the crushing defeats on both the Eastern and Western fronts were undeniable proof that the Nazi Empire was crumbling. But despite the mounting pressure, Hitler refused to face reality. Instead, he retreated further into his own warped vision of the world. Historians continue to argue about the exact nature of Hitler's psychological decline in the final years of the war. Some suggest that his increasing isolation, compounded by his obsession with maintaining control, fueled his delusions of grandeur. Others believe that his ability to command loyalty through sheer force of will, backed by the machinery of terror he had built, allowed him to ignore the reality of his impending defeat. Regardless of the psychological underpinnings, the consequences of Hitler's refusal to confront the war's inevitable end were catastrophic. By the time the Allies invaded Normandy in June 1944, the end was all but assured. The sheer size of the Allied forces, combined with the failure of Hitler's earlier military strategies, meant that the Nazi regime had no chance of victory. Yet Hitler, locked in his Führer bunker beneath Berlin, refused to accept defeat. Even as the Soviet army approached from the east and the Western Allies advanced from the west, Hitler's mind remained clouded with thoughts of victory that could never come. His irrational decision-making, coupled with an unwillingness to listen to his generals, led to one failed offensive after another. By late 1944 and early 1945, Hitler had turned into something of a recluse, holed up in his bunker in the heart of Berlin. In a way, it was a fitting metaphor for his leadership, isolated, disconnected, and unable to see the world for what it truly was. His once thriving empire had been reduced to rubble, and his generals were either dead, in retreat, or in disarray. But rather than accept the inevitable, Hitler doubled down. He ordered his soldiers to fight to the death, unwilling to acknowledge the reality of Germany's impending collapse. As the Soviet Red Army closed in on Berlin in April 1945, Hitler's grip on power had completely disintegrated. Yet, remarkably, he continued to give orders, even as the city was being bombarded and surrounded. This bizarre disconnect from reality is still one of the most perplexing aspects of Hitler's final days. He was, by all accounts, a man on the verge of total collapse. His body was ravaged by illness, his mental state increasingly unstable, and his ability to command the loyalty of his followers had disappeared. But he clung to the idea of a final victory, a last-ditch effort to reverse the course of history. Historians often reflect on Hitler's refusal to leave Berlin as a symptom of his deepening insanity. Despite everything, the loss of his army, the encroaching enemy forces, and the inevitable collapse, Hitler remained convinced that his vision for Germany and the world would prevail. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, he held on to the belief that somehow, by sheer will, the Third Reich could survive. This dogged determination to fight on, despite the obvious futility, was one of the defining features of his leadership in the war's final stages. It was on April 30th, 1945, as the Soviet forces were closing in on his underground bunker, that Adolf Hitler took his own life. Historians continue to debate the exact details of his death, whether he committed suicide by taking cyanide or by a gunshot to the head, or whether Eva Braun, his companion, took the same fate alongside him. Regardless of the method, it was clear that Hitler's end was symbolic of the complete collapse of Nazi Germany. His death marked the final chapter in the story of the Third Reich. But while Hitler's life came to a violent and tragic end, the legacy of his actions would haunt the world for generations to come. The death of one man did not bring about the end of the destruction he had wrought. In fact, the war in Europe didn't truly end until May 8, 1945, when Germany officially surrendered. Even then, the scars left by Hitler's reign would take years, if not decades, to heal. And yet, his death did not wipe the slate clean. The consequences of his vision, his racist, imperialistic ideologies, were far-reaching, and they had already begun to poison the world long before his demise. After Hitler's death, the world was left to reckon with the aftermath of the war. The Allied forces faced the daunting task of rebuilding Europe while simultaneously grappling with the full scope of the atrocities that had been committed in the name of Nazi ideology. The Nuremberg trials, which began in late 1945, sought to bring Nazi leaders and war criminals to justice. But for many, the question remained, how could such a horrific chapter in human history be reconciled, understood, and prevented from ever happening again? Historians still grapple with this question. How did the world allow one man's vision to lead to the deaths of tens of millions of people? Was Hitler merely a product of his time? Or was he an aberration, a singular figure whose genius for manipulation and cruelty set him apart? Historians continue to argue about the extent to which Hitler's rise was driven by his own twisted ambition or the failings of the world around him. Some argue that his rise was inevitable, given the circumstances in Germany following World War I, while others suggest that it was the result of a complex set of political, social, and economic factors. What is certain, however, is that his legacy is one of unparalleled destruction, and his actions have left an indelible mark on the world. As we look back on the life of Adolf Hitler, it is important not to forget the lessons of the past. The horrors of the Holocaust, the devastation of World War II, and the immense suffering caused by Hitler's rise to power are reminders of the dangers of unchecked hate and authoritarianism. His legacy lives on in the lessons we must continue to teach and learn from, so that history does not repeat itself. As the Allies marched through the ruins of Nazi-occupied Europe, the full scale of Hitler's regime's atrocities began to come into sharper focus. The destruction left in his wake was not just physical, but cultural, psychological, and moral. While his death marked the symbolic end of Nazi Germany, it didn't erase the scars of his actions. The world had to contend with the sheer magnitude of what had been perpetrated under his rule, an ideological movement that bent society and humanity toward unspeakable horrors. In the aftermath of Hitler's demise, Europe was left devastated, its cities reduced to rubble, its populations decimated, and its moral fabric torn apart. But perhaps one of the most unsettling aspects of the post-Hitler world was the knowledge that his ideas were not confined to Germany alone. Nazi ideology had spread across occupied territories, seeping into every corner of Europe, leaving a stain that would never quite be washed away. As the war came to a close, the question lingered: how could one man, armed with such dangerous ideas, convince so many people to follow him to the very brink of humanity's destruction? The Nuremberg trials, which began in 1945, became one of the first major steps toward reckoning with the aftermath of Hitler's reign. The trials sought justice for the countless war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Nazi officials. But the question of individual accountability was not straightforward. Hitler, after all, was dead. How could anyone fully explain the mechanisms of his regime and its far-reaching consequences? Historians have spent years analyzing how the Nazi Party, its leaders, and the German populace were able to turn a blind eye to the brutality of the Holocaust and the wide-ranging devastation caused by the war. The trials did bring some justice, but they also left many questions unanswered. The aftermath of the war also marked a key turning point for the German people themselves. How did they come to terms with their complicity, whether active or passive, in the crimes of the Nazi regime? Many Germans, in the years following the war, struggled with a sense of collective guilt and shame. While there were those who resisted the Nazi regime or fought in underground movements, the majority had either supported the Nazi government or remained silent, too fearful or too indoctrinated to act. The moral reckoning in post-war Germany was long and painful, and it would take decades for the full scope of the Nazi legacy to be understood and processed. In the decades following the war, the German people worked hard to rebuild their country. The country was divided into East and West Germany during the Cold War, and each side had its own method of coming to terms with the past. West Germany, under the leadership of its new democratic government, embarked on a process of denazification, although this was not always fully successful. In the East, under Soviet rule, the focus was on erasing the memory of Nazism, while simultaneously presenting the Soviet model as the only viable alternative. Even as the war ended and the German government was reborn, the shadow of Hitler's reign loomed large. It wasn't just the Germans who struggled to reckon with the past. The Allies also had to come to terms with the consequences of their own actions during the war. Allied bombing campaigns had devastated entire cities, resulting in civilian casualties. Some historians have questioned whether the Allied powers were justified in targeting German cities as part of their strategy. The question of moral superiority in war became more complex as time passed. Many people believed that the war had been justified, but some still wondered whether the methods used to defeat Hitler were themselves morally compromised. The psychological impact of Hitler's reign was also profound. For those who lived through the war, the horrors they witnessed were almost beyond description. Survivors of concentration camps, such as the survivors of Auschwitz, found it difficult to articulate their trauma in a way that others could understand. Many suffer from what we now recognize as PTSD, and their scars were often invisible. The world, in many ways, was unprepared for the emotional and psychological toll that the Holocaust had taken on its survivors. In the post-war years, the world slowly began to understand the full scope of the Holocaust. Historians, psychologists, and sociologists worked to make sense of the ways in which ordinary people could have been complicit in the murder of millions. One of the most profound questions to arise from this was the role of obedience. Psychologist Stanley Milgram's famous experiments on obedience to authority in the 1960s revealed disturbing truths about human nature, how ordinary people, under the right conditions, could be persuaded to commit unspeakable acts. This understanding raised important questions about how authoritarian regimes can manipulate entire populations into complicity. At the same time, global awareness of the Holocaust led to the creation of international frameworks to prevent future genocides. The United Nations established the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, laying the groundwork for a world where the dignity and rights of individuals would be prioritized. The Nuremberg trials set a precedent for international justice, and the idea of prosecuting individuals for crimes against humanity took root. Yet, the persistence of genocides in the decades that followed, such as in Rwanda, the Balkans, and Darfur, reminds us that the lessons of Hitler's time were never fully learned. Historians often point to the years following the war as a period of deep reflection and reckoning with the Nazi legacy. Germany, in particular, struggled with how to confront its past, while also attempting to rebuild its national identity. The post-war generation of Germans faced difficult questions about how to remember the atrocities of the Holocaust without perpetuating the myth of the good German, who was simply a victim of Nazi ideology. How could they acknowledge the horrors committed in their name without falling into the trap of shame and guilt? This moral struggle became a central theme in post-war German literature, film, and art. In the decades following World War II, Germany would go on to become a symbol of reconciliation and rebirth. By the 1980s and 1990s, Germany had transformed from a war-torn, divided country to a thriving democracy that had come to terms with its dark past. The German people, through their education system and national remembrance efforts, slowly began to build a new sense of identity, one that acknowledged the horrors of their past while striving to make amends for the crimes of the Nazi regime. As we look back at Adolf Hitler's reign and the devastation he caused, it's clear that his legacy is not just one of military defeat or personal demise. It is the enduring impact of a corrupted ideology. Hitler's vision was not just about territorial expansion or military dominance. It was about the complete annihilation of those who didn't fit into his narrow conception of the world. The Holocaust, the war, and the moral questions they raised continue to echo throughout history, reminding us of the dangers of unchecked hate, blind obedience, and the seductive power of authoritarianism. As the war came to a close, the full ramifications of Hitler's twisted vision of the world began to take shape in the form of a shattered continent and a world forever changed. Hitler's obsession with territorial expansion and his genocidal beliefs not only led to the destruction of Europe, but to the moral and ethical reckoning of the 20th century. The war had ended, but the long process of confronting the consequences of Nazi rule had only just begun. The horrors of the Holocaust and the devastation wrought by Nazi forces cast a shadow that would hang over the post-war world for generations. After Hitler's death, Europe was faced with the daunting task of rebuilding and reconciling the past. The countries that had once been under Nazi rule had to rebuild not only their physical infrastructure, but also their moral fabric. In Germany, a new generation had to come to terms with the legacy of the Third Reich. The question was no longer just how to rebuild the nation, but how to reckon with the atrocities committed in its name. The Nuremberg trials had set the stage for justice, but as the years passed, the question of collective guilt and responsibility continued to haunt the nation. How could Germans reconcile their pride in their country with the shame of its past? In the years immediately following the war, Germany was divided into two separate states: East Germany, under Soviet control, and West Germany, which became a democratic republic supported by the Western Allies. The division of Germany, however, did not simply reflect political and ideological differences. It was a painful symbol of the unresolved questions surrounding the country's Nazi past. East Germany, with its communist government, sought to erase the memory of Nazism and focus instead on its new identity as a socialist state. West Germany, on the other hand, faced the more difficult task of confronting the past while building a new democratic system. The process of denazification, which sought to remove former Nazis from positions of power, was slow and often ineffective. Many Nazis were able to reintegrate into society, and the scars of their regime were not fully addressed. Historians continue to debate the success of the denazification process in post-war Germany. While there were certainly efforts to remove Nazi influence from government, education, and industry, these efforts were often stymied by the need for rapid reconstruction and the desire to move on from the past. The process of reckoning with the past was more difficult for some than for others, and many former Nazis found themselves in positions of power again, both in Germany and beyond. This situation created a complex dynamic. Germany had to rebuild itself economically and politically, but the psychological and moral cost of doing so was far from simple. The moral and psychological wounds of the Holocaust were not just felt in Germany. They were felt across Europe and indeed across the world. Survivors of the Holocaust, many of whom had lost their families, their homes, and their entire communities, were left to grapple with unimaginable trauma. The emotional toll on survivors was compounded by the fact that their stories were often met with disbelief or indifference in the years following the war. As Holocaust survivors tried to rebuild their lives, they faced not only the horrors of their past, but the challenge of ensuring that their stories would not be forgotten. The global reaction to the Holocaust was also complicated by the geopolitics of the post-war era. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union created divisions in how the Holocaust was remembered and represented. In the West, the Holocaust was framed as a symbol of the dangers of totalitarianism and a rallying cry for the defense of democracy. In the East, however, under Soviet control, the Holocaust was sometimes downplayed in favor of focusing on the broader struggle against fascism. Historians and scholars from both sides of the Iron Curtain had different approaches to analyzing the Holocaust, and this ideological divide often influenced the ways in which the tragedy was discussed and remembered. As the decades pass, the memory of the Holocaust began to take on a more prominent role in the global consciousness. In the 1960s and 1970s, there was a growing movement to preserve the memory of the Holocaust and educate future generations about the dangers of anti-Semitism, racism, and hatred. Holocaust memorials were built in Germany and throughout Europe, and survivors began to speak out about their experiences. The United Nations declared January 27th, the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, as International Holocaust Remembrance Day in 2005, further cementing the importance of remembering the atrocities committed during the Nazi era. Despite these efforts, the shadow of Hitler's ideology still looms over the world. Anti-Semitism, racism, and extremism continue to rear their ugly heads in various parts of the world, and the lessons of the Holocaust are often forgotten or ignored. The rise of far-right political movements in recent years, particularly in Europe and the United States, has sparked fears that the dangerous ideologies of the past are resurfacing. Historians and educators continue to stress the importance of remembering the Holocaust, not only to honor the victims but to ensure that such a tragedy is never repeated. Historians still wrestle with the question of why Hitler was able to gain such widespread support and influence in Germany. What made his ideology so appealing to a country struggling with economic hardship, political instability, and a sense of national humiliation? The answer, many believe, lies in his ability to tap into deep-seated fears and frustrations and to offer a vision of hope, strength, and national pride in exchange for blind loyalty. Hitler promised to restore Germany to its rightful place in the world, and millions of people believe in that promise. But in the end, his vision was built on lies, hatred, and violence, and the consequences were catastrophic. As we look back on the life and death of Adolf Hitler, we are reminded of the dangers of unchecked power and the fragility of democracy. The legacy of Hitler's reign is a stark warning of how easily a society can be swayed by the promises of an authoritarian leader, especially when that society is in crisis. We must never forget the lessons of history, for the echoes of the past still resonate in the present. The world must continue to confront the legacy of Nazism and strive to build a future where the values of equality, justice, and humanity are upheld. As the years after World War II unfolded, one of the most profound challenges faced by the world was not only the rebuilding of Europe, but the moral and philosophical rebuilding of human civilization itself. The monstrous legacy of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich and the barbaric systems he put into place left scars that would shape global politics, culture, and consciousness for decades to come. The question of how to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again became an urgent priority for nations across the globe. The very fact that such a monstrous ideology could rise to power in one of the world's most advanced societies haunted leaders, intellectuals, and citizens alike. In Germany, the immediate post-war period was one of guilt, confusion, and severe disillusionment. The weight of the Third Reich's actions was so overwhelming that it was difficult for many to even begin to process what had happened. The destruction of cities, the loss of millions of lives, and the brutal repression of entire peoples were impossible to reconcile with the image of Germany as a cultured, sophisticated nation. The Germans themselves were left grappling with a moral reckoning of unprecedented scope. How could they confront the fact that many of their fellow countrymen had enthusiastically supported a regime that not only led to the loss of life on an unimaginable scale, but also, more terrifyingly, helped bring about the dehumanization of entire groups of people? Historians have long debated how much responsibility the average German citizen held in supporting or passively allowing the rise of Nazi ideology. Was the German public simply swept along by propaganda, or were they complicit in the atrocities committed? What is clear is that the complexity of Germany's post-war reckoning was one of the most difficult aspects of the reconstruction process. While the government began to take steps to denazify its institutions, many Nazis found ways to reintegrate into society, either by hiding their pasts or receiving minimal punishment. For the average German, coming to terms with the past was a long and painful process, and many turned to a kind of collective amnesia, refusing to confront the role that their country had played in the horrors of the Holocaust. As Germany and Europe rebuilt, the rest of the world turned its eyes to the future, hoping to create a framework for peace and justice that could ensure the atrocities of Hitler's regime were never repeated. The United Nations, formed in 1945, was one of the most important steps in this direction. Its charter, grounded in the principles of human rights and self-determination, sought to establish international norms that could prevent the rise of future tyrants like Hitler. Alongside this, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948, explicitly outlining the fundamental rights that every human being should be entitled to, rights that would help protect future generations from the horrors of war and genocide. While the establishment of international institutions was a significant step toward creating a more peaceful and just world, it would be naive to think that the specter of Nazism had been entirely laid to rest. In the decades following World War II, the ideological battle between democracy and authoritarianism continued to play out on a global stage, with the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union defining much of the post-war political landscape. While the United States and Western Europe largely embraced democratic values and liberal human rights, the Soviet Union, though claiming to oppose fascism, engaged in its own forms of oppression. This period was marked by totalitarian regimes in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and later in various parts of the world. It raised the uncomfortable question of whether the seeds of tyranny were more deeply embedded in human nature than many wish to admit. At the same time, the memory of the Holocaust remained a powerful, haunting reminder of the dangers of unchecked authoritarianism. Holocaust survivors, many of whom had lost their entire families, faced the almost impossible task of rebuilding their lives. For many, the trauma of the Holocaust never fully left them. In the years that followed the war, there was a long struggle for recognition and justice. Survivors sought acknowledgement of their suffering, and many struggled to have their voices heard in a world that, at times, seemed eager to move on from the horrors of the past. For the survivors, the question was not just about surviving, but ensuring that their stories were told and remembered. They worked tirelessly to preserve the history of what had happened, to make sure that future generations would never forget the darkness that had descended on Europe. The creation of Holocaust memorials and museums, particularly in Germany, became a critical part of this process. The survivors played a crucial role in educating the world about the Holocaust, ensuring that their stories would not be buried in the sands of time. But as the years passed, a disturbing trend began to emerge. Denial and distortion of the Holocaust began to rear its ugly head. Holocaust denial, the revisionist ideology that seeks to minimize or completely deny the systematic extermination of Jews and other minorities by the Nazis, emerged as a dangerous fringe movement. Though the survivors and their families worked to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive, these revisionists continued to spread their falsehoods, distorting the truth in an attempt to rehabilitate Hitler's image or exonerate the Nazi regime. The rise of neo-Nazism in the post-war world presented another dark chapter in the legacy of Adolf Hitler. The influence of his ideology persisted in extremist groups and far-right movements, both in Europe and the United States. The idea of the master race and the belief in the supremacy of one ethnic group over others continued to resonate with those who felt disenfranchised or embittered by social change. While the direct political power of the Nazis had been crushed, their ideas were far from extinguished. In Germany, after decades of reckoning with the past, the nation had made significant strides in confronting the legacy of the Nazi era. Modern Germany is a democratic, prosperous country that has made an effort to come to terms with its past. Through education, remembrance, and a commitment to human rights, Germany has attempted to build a future that acknowledges the darkness of its history while striving to never repeat the horrors of the Third Reich. Yet, as we look at the rise of far-right populism in recent years, we are reminded that Hitler's dangerous vision of society still holds sway over some corners of the world. His ability to manipulate fear, hatred, and economic despair into a movement that would nearly conquer Europe is a stark reminder of the power that charismatic, authoritarian leaders can wield, particularly in times of crisis. The world must remain vigilant, for the lessons of history are only effective if we continue to remember them. In examining the life of Adolf Hitler and the legacy of the Nazi regime, we are forced to confront the darkest aspects of human nature: our capacity for cruelty, our susceptibility to propaganda, and our tendency to dehumanize others. But it is also a reminder of the strength of the human spirit, the resilience of those who survived, and the power of memory and education to ensure that such a tragedy is never repeated. While Hitler's death marked the end of his reign, the long and difficult process of reckoning with his legacy continues to shape the world. As the war ground to its final, inevitable conclusion, the world began to confront the moral and intellectual fallout from the Nazi regime's terrifying vision. While Hitler's physical reign ended with his suicide in the Führer bunker in April 1945, the far-reaching consequences of his ideas would resonate for decades. Germany, Europe, and the world had to reckon not just with the destruction of war, but with the sinister ideology that had led to it. The very idea that an entire nation could be consumed by such a dangerous and hateful vision was, and still is, a chilling reminder of how fragile peace and democracy can be. The immediate aftermath of the war was a chaotic period of rebuilding, not only in the sense of physical infrastructure, but also morally and psychologically. Europe had been ravaged, millions had perished, and the very foundation of European civilization had been shaken to its core. Germany, in particular, faced the intense challenge of reconstructing a nation that had been complicit in some of the greatest horrors ever perpetrated by humankind. The task of reconciliation was monumental, especially when the nature of the crimes committed under the Nazi regime was so immense. For many Germans, the collapse of Nazi Germany and Hitler's demise was not the end of their suffering. It was the beginning of a deep moral reckoning. One of the most crucial aspects of post-war Germany was the effort to confront the Holocaust and its ramifications. The survivors, many of whom were left with scars that were both physical and psychological, had to work not only to rebuild their lives, but also to ensure that their stories were heard. The sheer scale of the Holocaust made it impossible to ignore, but it also made it difficult for many to comprehend. Survivors sought to create a lasting memory of the genocide, not just to honor the victims, but to ensure that the world never forgot the dangers of unchecked hatred and authoritarianism. In the years following the war, one of the most significant challenges facing Europe was the moral dilemma of collective responsibility. The Nuremberg trials, which began in 1945, were an attempt to hold the top leaders of the Nazi regime accountable for their actions. The trials brought to light the chilling reality of what had been done in the name of the Nazi ideology. The prosecution of Nazi war criminals was an essential part of the post-war reckoning, but the question of broader responsibility was far more complex. How could an entire nation, many of whom had supported or been complicit in the regime, come to terms with what had happened? It was a question that many Germans struggled with for years, and the psychological and emotional toll of confronting their past was a burden that could not be easily shouldered. The Nuremberg trials also highlighted another crucial issue: the role of obedience in Nazi Germany. One of the most troubling aspects of the Holocaust was the number of ordinary citizens and soldiers who carried out the atrocities. The psychological concept of obedience to authority became a key focus for understanding how such horrors could have occurred. Historian Christopher Browning, in his book Ordinary Men, explores the idea that many of the men who participated in the massacres of Jews during the Holocaust were not inherently evil, but were simply following orders. This chilling reality posed unsettling questions about human nature. Could any of us, under the right circumstances, be swayed to participate in such horrors? This is a question that historians and psychologists continue to explore, as it raises unsettling implications for the future. In the years after the war, as Germany began its long process of rebuilding, the nation was split into two parts, East and West. The ideological division between the Soviet-backed East Germany and the capitalist West Germany created a stark contrast in how each side dealt with its Nazi past. In the West, the Federal Republic of Germany began the process of democratic integration into the European community, while also grappling with the weight of its past. West Germany, in the early years, focused on what many called denazification, an effort to remove former Nazis from positions of power and influence. But this process was far from perfect. Many former Nazis managed to reintegrate into society, and the task of coming to terms with the full scope of the Holocaust was a slow and painful one. Meanwhile, East Germany, under Soviet control, worked to erase the remnants of Nazism from public memory. However, the communist regime was focused less on confronting the Holocaust and more on promoting a Soviet-style narrative that framed the Nazi era within the broader context of the struggle against fascism. This disparity between East and West Germany left a divided legacy in how the country dealt with its past, one that would not be fully reconciled until reunification in 1990. The memory of the Holocaust and the moral responsibility of Germany continued to be a major part of the nation's collective identity even after the fall of the Berlin Wall. For the reunited Germany, confronting its past became an essential part of moving forward. This process was not without controversy, as questions about the level of guilt and the responsibility of Germans, both those who supported the Nazi regime and those who were complicit through their silence, continued to be debated. In addition to the efforts within Germany to confront the past, the rest of the world also had a role to play in ensuring that Hitler's legacy was not forgotten. The creation of Holocaust museums and memorials around the world, most notably the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and Yad Vashem in Israel, helped preserve the memory of the millions who perished. These institutions serve as both a tribute to the victims and a reminder of the need to confront intolerance and hatred wherever it arises. One of the most crucial aspects of the post-war world was the commitment to ensuring that genocides and crimes against humanity would not occur again. The creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 and the establishment of international courts to prosecute war criminals were part of a larger effort to create a world order based on justice and accountability. But as we have seen in the decades since, the challenge of preventing future genocides remains daunting. The horrors of the Holocaust are still fresh in the memory of many, but the rise of authoritarianism, nationalism, and hate-driven ideologies in various parts of the world suggest that the lessons of the past are far from learned. The ongoing fight against anti-Semitism, racism, and extremism shows that Hitler's ideas have not disappeared. While the structures of the Nazi regime were destroyed in 1945, its legacy continues to inspire hate and violence in various corners of the world. This is why the remembrance of the Holocaust and the lessons it teaches about the dangers of unchecked power are still as relevant today as they ever were. The memory of Adolf Hitler and his regime must remain a cornerstone of our collective history, not just to honor the victims, but to remind us of the moral responsibility we all share in preventing such atrocities from ever happening again. As the world continued to grapple with the aftermath of Adolf Hitler's reign, the years following his death revealed not only the depths of the destruction caused by the Nazis, but also the indelible scars left on the global consciousness. Hitler's vision of a racially pure, dominant Germany had failed spectacularly, but the ideological influence he left behind was far from erased. As the world worked to rebuild and recover, the question that remained was how to ensure such an ideology could never take root again. The Cold War was a defining feature of the post-war era, a period in which the ideological battle between democracy and totalitarianism played out across the globe. In the early years after World War II, Germany was divided into East and West, and the legacy of Nazism became entangled in the global struggle for ideological dominance. East Germany, under Soviet control, was seen as a bastion of communism, while West Germany, supported by the United States and its Western allies, became a symbol of democracy and capitalism. This division would be crucial in shaping the way both the German population and the international community viewed the aftermath of the Third Reich. In the Soviet-controlled East, efforts to confront the Nazi past were often downplayed in favor of highlighting the role of the Soviet Union in defeating fascism. The focus was placed on framing the Nazis as part of a broader struggle against imperialism, while the uncomfortable truths about the extent of the Nazi atrocities were less openly discussed. The Soviet regime, after all, had its own history of repression and totalitarianism, and acknowledging the full scope of the Holocaust might have been seen as undermining its own legitimacy. In West Germany, the situation was more complicated. Though the country was initially rebuilt with significant American support, the process of reckoning with the Nazi past was neither immediate nor easy. The idea of denazification was introduced, but was far from flawless. While efforts were made to remove prominent Nazis from positions of power, many former party members continued to operate within the system, particularly within the military and civil service. Furthermore, the economic boom that took place in West Germany during the 1950s and 1960s, known as the Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle, meant that many Germans were preoccupied with rebuilding their lives and their country. Confronting the deep moral questions of Nazi complicity often took a back seat to economic progress. As the decades passed, the issue of Nazi guilt and responsibility remained a topic of intense debate in Germany. The older generation, many of whom had lived through the horrors of the Nazi era, often felt guilt-ridden and burdened by the knowledge of what had transpired. Meanwhile, the younger generation, who had not lived through the war, found themselves caught between a desire to honor the victims of the Holocaust and an overwhelming sense of national shame. The question of how to come to terms with the past and whether the nation as a whole was responsible for the atrocities committed remained at the forefront of the national conversation. One of the most significant developments in post-war Germany was the creation of Holocaust memorials and museums. In the 1980s, Germany began to take a more active role in remembering the Holocaust. The German government invested in educational programs and the establishment of memorials, particularly in Berlin, where the Jewish victims of the Holocaust were commemorated. The Jewish Museum in Berlin, which opened in 2001, is one such institution dedicated to preserving the memory of the victims and educating the public about the atrocities of the Nazi regime. These memorials were an important step in ensuring that the horrors of the Holocaust were not forgotten and that future generations would be reminded of the dangers of hatred and intolerance. In the international community, the Holocaust also became a central part of the collective memory. Countries around the world, particularly those affected by the war, established their own memorials and days of remembrance. The United States, for example, established the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., which opened in 1993. These memorials not only honor the victims, but also serve as a constant reminder of the need to protect human rights and prevent such atrocities from happening again. The lessons of the Holocaust became part of the global conversation about human rights, and the atrocities committed during the war were used as a moral benchmark to guide international law and diplomacy. However, even as these efforts to preserve memory and educate the public continued, the dangerous ideologies that underpinned Hitler's rise to power did not disappear. In fact, the rise of far-right and neo-Nazi groups in Europe and the United States in recent decades has demonstrated how easily Hitler's hateful ideology can be revived. The resurgence of white supremacist movements, the rise of populist authoritarian leaders, and the spread of xenophobia and anti-Semitism are all troubling reminders that the world has not fully learned from the past. The question of how to prevent future atrocities, how to ensure that the world never again falls victim to the dangerous allure of authoritarianism and hate, remains as urgent as ever. The lessons of the Holocaust, particularly the need to fight intolerance, bigotry, and discrimination, must be passed down through the generations. The memory of Hitler's reign must not fade, not only to honor the victims, but also to ensure that humanity does not repeat the mistakes of the past. Historians often stress that remembering the Holocaust is not enough on its own. It must be accompanied by action. The rise of neo-Nazi groups and the proliferation of hate speech on social media highlight the continued relevance of this struggle. In the age of globalization and interconnectedness, the lessons of the past must be applied to the present. The global community must remain vigilant against the forces of hatred and extremism, no matter where they arise. History has shown us the dangers of complacency, and the world must remain committed to preventing the kind of darkness that Hitler unleashed from ever taking root again. In the end, the legacy of Adolf Hitler is not just a tragic chapter in the history of Germany. It is a cautionary tale for the entire world. The rise of the Third Reich is a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, the fragility of democracy, and the horrors that can occur when hatred is allowed to flourish. As we move forward, we must remember the victims of the Holocaust, honor their memory, and ensure that future generations are equipped with the knowledge and resolve to prevent such atrocities from happening again. The aftermath of Adolf Hitler's reign brought forth a relentless wave of reflection, remorse, and, at times, denial. For many, the task of understanding how such horrors could be unleashed by a single individual and supported by an entire nation seemed insurmountable. The repercussions of Hitler's reign were not just felt in the immediate years after the war. They reverberated across the 20th century and continue to shape our world today. His rule was a distortion of human potential, using charisma, fear, and manipulation to propel an entire society toward mass destruction. The challenge of comprehending this part of history is far from over, and it asks an important question that many still struggle with. How can a society fall so deeply into hate, and how do we ensure it doesn't happen again? Post-war Germany, especially in the years leading to its reunification in 1990, underwent a long and painful process of moral reconstruction. The debate over the collective guilt of the German people still looms large. While some argue that the atrocities of the Nazis were the result of a small group of fanatical leaders, others contend that the widespread complicity of the population contributed to the regime's success. Historians have long debated whether the German populace was simply following orders, as many would claim in later years, or whether they were willingly swept up in a tide of fascism. The disturbing reality is that a large part of the population, in both subtle and overt ways, contributed to Hitler's rise to power. Whether through active support, passive complicity, or indifference to the suffering of others, the vast machinery of Nazi Germany operated with the acquiescence, if not the enthusiastic endorsement, of many people. As Germany worked through this complex history, the rest of the world, too, had to reckon with the lessons of World War II. The United Nations, established in 1945, represented an attempt to build a new world order that prioritized peace, diplomacy, and the protection of human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, passed in 1948, aimed to provide a moral framework that could safeguard individuals against the kind of abuses seen under Hitler's regime. The Holocaust, more than any other atrocity in modern history, became a touchstone for human rights advocates. The phrase "never again" became a rallying cry, as the world pledged to prevent the recurrence of such horrors. Despite these lofty ideals, the decades following World War II have not been without their own human rights struggles. While the Nuremberg trials and the establishment of international courts set precedents for holding perpetrators of atrocities accountable, the global community has had its own share of failures. Genocides such as those in Rwanda, Bosnia, and Darfur demonstrated that the mechanisms put in place after the war were not always sufficient to prevent such violence. These later tragedies serve as a reminder that vigilance is necessary, that ideologies of hate do not simply vanish with the end of one regime, and that the fight for human dignity must be ceaseless. Historians frequently refer to the period following Hitler's death as a time of moral disillusionment. It wasn't just the physical ruins of Europe that needed rebuilding. It was the moral and ideological destruction left behind. The Holocaust and the war left Europe's conscience in tatters, and the world had to deal with the burden of the moral questions that Hitler's reign left in its wake. For many, the war raised uncomfortable questions about human nature, questions that continue to be discussed and debated today. How is it that a sophisticated, educated society like Germany could descend into barbarism so quickly? How did millions of ordinary people become complicit in mass murder and oppression? The answers are not simple, and they demand us to look deeply into the nature of power, propaganda, and human psychology. One of the most critical aspects of understanding Hitler's rise is recognizing how the Nazi regime manipulated and distorted the German people's sense of national identity and pride. Hitler, a master of propaganda, capitalized on the economic instability and national humiliation caused by World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. He offered a vision of a Germany that would rise from the ashes and reclaim its rightful place in the world. This message resonated with many Germans, particularly those who were suffering from the economic depression of the 1920s and early 1930s. Hitler's speeches, filled with promises of national renewal, gave the masses a sense of purpose and belonging. He framed the Jews, communists, and other minorities as scapegoats for Germany's suffering, directing the collective anger of the population toward a common enemy. The power of propaganda, which Hitler and his minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, used to manipulate public opinion, cannot be overstated. The Nazis understood the power of imagery, repetition, and emotional appeal. Mass rallies, public speeches, films, and radio broadcasts all served to cement the Nazi message in the minds of the German people. Hitler's ability to unite a fractured, desperate nation behind a single vision of hate and conquest is one of the most chilling aspects of his reign. The Nazis didn't just control the German government. They controlled the narrative, shaping how Germans saw themselves, their world, and their place in it. In the years following the war, the global response to Hitler's crimes also influenced the way the world understood totalitarianism. The war and the Holocaust exposed the dangers of unchecked power and the devastating effects of extreme ideologies. It became evident that such ideologies could take root anywhere, not just in Germany. The fight against fascism, racism, and authoritarianism became a global one, but the scars left by Hitler's regime still serve as a warning that we, as human beings, must remain ever vigilant against forces that seek to divide and dehumanize us. The existence of neo-Nazi movements and far-right extremist groups in the modern world is a reminder that Hitler's toxic ideas have never truly disappeared. These movements often exploit economic instability, fear of outsiders, and feelings of cultural alienation to recruit new followers. While they may not have the same power or reach as the Nazi regime, their presence in society today highlights the persistent danger of hate and division. These groups often target vulnerable communities, using the same propaganda tactics that Hitler employed to foster hatred and violence. It is a stark reminder that the lessons of the Holocaust, though taught in schools and memorialized in museums, are still not universally understood or respected. But even amid these modern challenges, it's important to remember the resilience of the human spirit. The survivors of the Holocaust and the generations that followed have shown an extraordinary capacity to rebuild their lives, preserve their memories, and fight for justice. Their courage and determination ensure that the horrors of the past are never forgotten, and that future generations understand the devastating consequences of hatred and intolerance. As we look back on the life and legacy of Adolf Hitler, we must do so with an understanding that the lessons of his reign are not confined to the past. They are lessons for today and for the future, lessons about the dangers of extremism, the fragility of democracy, and the enduring importance of human rights. The dark legacy of Hitler's rule reminds us of the power of propaganda, the fragility of social cohesion, and the importance of vigilance in safeguarding the values of equality, justice, and dignity for all. As the world continued to reckon with the catastrophic consequences of Hitler's regime, another important element began to emerge in the global conversation: the psychological scars left by Nazi ideology. For many who had lived through the war, particularly survivors of the Holocaust, the trauma was not something that could be easily erased or even fully understood by those who hadn't experienced it. The emotional and psychological toll on Holocaust survivors was immeasurable, and the generations that followed would be affected by the reverberations of this trauma. Yet, despite the immense pain, these survivors became the primary witnesses to the horrors of the Nazi regime, and their testimonies and efforts to preserve the memory of the Holocaust were crucial in shaping the moral reckoning of the post-war world. The survivors of the concentration camps carried with them not only physical scars, but also profound emotional and psychological wounds. Many of them had lost entire families, friends, and communities. The stories of children separated from their parents, the horrors of forced labor, the constant fear of death, and the dehumanization that occurred in the camps became etched in their minds forever. Yet even as they tried to rebuild their lives, many Holocaust survivors found themselves haunted by what they had witnessed and endured. The emotional impact of their experiences was compounded by the fact that, for many years, the broader world was slow to recognize or understand the magnitude of the suffering they had endured. In the early years after the war, many survivors found it difficult to find outlets for their trauma. The world seemed to want to move on, to rebuild, and look forward to a future without the horrors of the war. But for the survivors, this was impossible. They had witnessed unimaginable atrocities, and they struggled to understand how the world could simply move on without confronting the reality of what had happened. Holocaust survivors, often living in silence for many years, became the voices of memory, sharing their stories with the world and ensuring that future generations would never forget the darkness of Hitler's regime. It was only in the decades following the war that the full psychological impact of the Holocaust began to be recognized. In the 1960s and 1970s, psychologists began to understand the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as it applied to Holocaust survivors. For the first time, the long-term psychological consequences of such an extreme form of trauma were acknowledged. Survivors began to find a language to describe their suffering, and the world began to listen. The personal stories and testimonies of survivors became a vital part of the historical record, and their voices became the cornerstone of Holocaust education. Survivors not only fought to preserve the memory of their experiences, but also to educate the world about the dangers of hatred, discrimination, and unchecked power. Holocaust memorials, museums, and educational programs began to proliferate throughout the world, many of them created with the input of survivors. These institutions became places of remembrance, not just for the victims, but for the survivors as well. They became spaces where people could gather to reflect on the past, honor the dead, and discuss the continuing relevance of the lessons from the Holocaust. Yet, as the years passed, a new generation began to emerge, one that had not experienced the war or the trauma firsthand. The challenge for educators, particularly in Germany, was how to ensure that the memory of the Holocaust would not fade, and how to keep its lessons relevant for a new generation that was increasingly distanced from the events of World War II. As the number of Holocaust survivors dwindled with time, the importance of education and remembrance became more pronounced. Efforts to document survivor testimonies, preserve artifacts, and teach about the Holocaust reached a global audience. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, established in Washington, D.C., in 1993, became one of the central institutions dedicated to educating the world about the Holocaust. It is one of many institutions worldwide that continues to play a crucial role in ensuring that the lessons of the past are passed down to future generations. However, despite these efforts, Holocaust denial and revisionism have remained significant challenges in the post-war era. In recent years, a disturbing rise in anti-Semitism, particularly in Europe, has underscored the persistence of the hateful ideologies that fueled Hitler's regime. Neo-Nazi groups and far-right extremists continue to spread false narratives, seeking to downplay or deny the extent of the Holocaust. This dangerous revisionism often goes hand in hand with a resurgence of hate-driven political movements that use the same divisive rhetoric that Hitler used to manipulate the German population. The rise of such groups is a stark reminder that the fight against hate is an ongoing battle, and that the lessons of the Holocaust must remain at the forefront of our collective consciousness. The modern resurgence of far-right movements, which continue to exploit the same fears and anxieties that Hitler manipulated, is deeply troubling. These movements often capitalize on economic instability, societal polarization, and fears of immigration to push xenophobic and nationalist agendas. While the tactics may have evolved, the underlying ideology remains eerily familiar. It serves as a reminder that the forces of hatred and intolerance are never fully eradicated. They can and do reappear when the conditions are ripe. This underscores the importance of continuing to educate people about the dangers of authoritarianism and the need for constant vigilance against hate and extremism. It is not just in the political realm where Hitler's legacy still has an impact. Cultural narratives surrounding the Nazi regime, especially in Germany, continue to wrestle with how to balance remembrance with the need to move forward. As the country has worked to rebuild itself after the war, it has faced the challenge of creating a new national identity, one that acknowledges the horrors of the Nazi era while also emphasizing its commitment to democracy, human rights, and reconciliation. This process of coming to terms with the past has been painful, but necessary for Germany to reclaim its place in the world as a peaceful, democratic nation. Perhaps one of the most important lessons from the legacy of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime is the enduring need to guard against the dangers of authoritarianism. History has shown that when individuals or groups are allowed to rise to power unchecked, when societies are fractured and ripe for manipulation, the potential for tyrannical leaders to manipulate populations toward dangerous and destructive ends is ever present. This is why the study of Hitler's rise to power, the mechanisms of propaganda, and the manipulation of social anxieties remains so critical. We must understand how it happened so we can prevent it from happening again. The fight for human rights, dignity, and justice is never over. The lessons of the Holocaust remain as vital as ever, and the memory of those who suffered and died at the hands of Hitler's regime must serve as a constant reminder of the fragility of our shared humanity. We must work together across nations and generations to uphold the values of tolerance, compassion, and respect for all people, no matter their background, ethnicity, or beliefs. Only by doing so can we ensure that the darkness of Hitler's era remains a historical lesson, rather than a prelude to a future we all wish to avoid. The lessons of Adolf Hitler's rule and the subsequent devastation of Nazi Germany are stark reminders of humanity's capacity for both evil and resilience. The shadow of his regime is still felt around the world today, as societies continue to grapple with the ideological and political forces he unleashed. The question that lingers is not just how Hitler rose to power, but how we, as a global society, can prevent the recurrence of such horrors. The dangers of unchecked power, extremist ideologies, and the manipulation of the masses are as relevant today as they were in the 1930s and 1940s. One of the most sobering aspects of Hitler's rise to power was his ability to exploit the vulnerabilities of an entire population. Germany, deeply wounded by the aftermath of World War I, was suffering from economic collapse, political instability, and widespread disillusionment. Hitler understood this vulnerability and used it to his advantage. He capitalized on the fears of the German people, fear of communism, fear of economic ruin, and fear of losing national identity. His promises of restoring Germany to greatness resonated with many, and his ability to use propaganda to manipulate the public's perception of reality was chilling. But Hitler's regime also reveals something even more troubling: how an entire society can fall prey to authoritarian rule. It wasn't just a small group of elites or military leaders that supported the Nazis. It was a broad swath of the German population, many of whom were convinced that the Nazi vision of a pure, powerful Germany was a just cause. Some were swept up in the fervor of Nazi ideology, others were motivated by fear, and still others simply turned a blind eye to the atrocities unfolding around them. This collective willingness to ignore or rationalize the actions of the regime became a key factor in the Nazis' success. It's important to recognize that Hitler's power was not simply a product of his personal genius. It was a product of the environment in which he rose. Economic despair, social division, and political fragmentation created the perfect breeding ground for extremist ideas. And this is where the lessons of Hitler's rise resonate most clearly today. Populist movements, often driven by fear and resentment, have resurfaced in recent years, not just in Germany, but in countries across the world. These movements often rely on rhetoric that stokes fear of the other, be it immigrants, minorities, or political opponents. They promise to restore lost greatness and offer simple solutions to complex problems. And while the context may differ, the tactics used to rally people to these causes are strikingly similar to those used by Hitler and the Nazis. One of the key factors in preventing such ideologies from taking hold again is education. The Holocaust and the rise of Nazism must be taught and remembered, not just as a historical event, but as a warning. The Holocaust, with its unspeakable horrors, serves as the most glaring example of what can happen when prejudice, hatred, and totalitarianism are allowed to flourish unchecked. It's a reminder of the importance of tolerance, understanding, and empathy in maintaining a just and peaceful society. Holocaust education, which includes learning about the dehumanization of Jews, Romani people, LGBTQ+ individuals, disabled people, and other marginalized groups, is essential in ensuring that future generations do not forget the consequences of racial and religious intolerance. Furthermore, the rise of extremism today requires vigilance not just from governments, but from citizens. The power to prevent the spread of hate lies in the hands of the people. It's not just about counteracting extremist ideologies at the political level. It's about fostering a culture of empathy, understanding, and respect for diversity at every level of society. The fight against hate and extremism is not just the responsibility of lawmakers or international organizations. It's a collective responsibility that requires individuals to stand up against injustice wherever it appears. In the modern era, the global community must also confront the legacy of genocide and human rights violations beyond the Holocaust. The international response to the Holocaust set a precedent for accountability and justice, but as we've seen in the years following the war, there are still far too many instances where atrocities have been ignored or dismissed. Genocides in Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, and elsewhere remind us that the lessons of World War II have not been fully learned, and the forces of hatred, intolerance, and authoritarianism continue to pose a threat to the world. One of the most critical ways to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust remain relevant is to continue to prosecute war crimes and crimes against humanity. The Nuremberg trials, which prosecuted the leaders of the Nazi regime, set an important legal precedent for the international community. They established the principle that individuals could be held accountable for committing atrocities, even if they were following orders. The International Criminal Court (ICC), established in 2002, has taken up this mantle, prosecuting individuals for war crimes and crimes against humanity. However, the ICC and other international courts often face significant challenges in bringing perpetrators to justice, especially when powerful political interests are at play. This highlights the ongoing need for a stronger, more unified international response to war crimes and human rights violations. Another key component of ensuring that history is not repeated lies in the preservation of memory. The Holocaust, like other instances of genocide, must be remembered not only as a historical event, but as a living lesson that informs how we interact with one another today. Holocaust survivors, whose voices have shaped our understanding of this dark chapter in history, continue to advocate for the importance of memory and education. But as the number of survivors dwindles, the responsibility to preserve and pass on these lessons falls to future generations. The rise of social media, combined with the proliferation of misinformation, has made it more difficult than ever to control the spread of hate. The internet has allowed extremist groups to organize, spread their messages, and recruit followers with alarming speed and reach. In a world where information can be manipulated and distorted, it is crucial that we remain vigilant in our defense of truth, justice, and human rights. Fighting hate and extremism today requires not only combating false narratives, but also fostering critical thinking and media literacy. The power of propaganda in the Nazi era is a testament to how dangerous the manipulation of information can be, and it's a lesson we must not forget. As we continue to reflect on Hitler's legacy, it is essential to remember that while his reign ended with the defeat of Nazi Germany, the battle against the ideologies he championed is ongoing. His life and actions serve as a haunting reminder of the dangers of unchecked authoritarianism, xenophobia, and hate. But it also reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit, the importance of education, and the need to uphold the values of justice, equality, and freedom. We owe it to the millions who suffered under Hitler's regime to continue the fight for a world where such horrors can never happen again. To do so, we must confront our shared history, understand its lessons, and remain vigilant in the face of any threat to the values of human dignity and peace. As we come to the final chapter of our exploration of Adolf Hitler's reign and its global consequences, we are left to consider the long-lasting effects of his ideology, not just in the context of history, but in the present day. The enduring legacy of Nazi ideology, rooted in extreme nationalism, racial purity, and authoritarian control, continues to cast a shadow on the world, warning us of the fragility of democracy and the power of unchecked hatred. While the fall of the Third Reich marked the physical defeat of Hitler's vision, it did not mark the end of the ideological battle that still looms over society today. The lessons of Hitler's rise to power and the horrors of the Holocaust are far from just historical anecdotes. They are deeply relevant today, especially as we witness the resurgence of authoritarianism and the growth of far-right movements in many parts of the world. The world has learned much from Hitler's regime, but those lessons must be consistently applied, especially in a time when extremist rhetoric is gaining traction in certain political circles. The rise of populist leaders, the spread of misinformation through digital media, and the resurgence of nationalism present ongoing challenges to the values of democracy, human rights, and social justice. One of the most important lessons of Hitler's rise is the power of propaganda and its ability to manipulate the masses. Hitler and his minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, understood that shaping public perception was just as important as military might. They used every available medium, films, posters, radio broadcasts, and public speeches to craft an image of Hitler as the savior of Germany, a leader who would restore the nation to greatness. This manipulation of public opinion was key to their success, and it highlights the dangers of unchecked media power. In today's world, where social media platforms allow for the rapid dissemination of information, the need for responsible media consumption and the fight against fake news and hate speech have never been more urgent. Similarly, the rise of extremism in the modern world has shown that the same social and political vulnerabilities that allowed Hitler to gain power still exist. Economic instability, social dislocation, and political fragmentation create an environment in which extremist ideologies can flourish. Today, many countries around the world are grappling with deep divides, political, economic, and cultural, that make them ripe for the exploitation of divisive, authoritarian leaders. While the context may be different, the tactics remain eerily familiar. The power of fear, scapegoating, and the promise of restoring lost greatness still resonate with many. In the face of these challenges, we must recognize the power of education, remembrance, and dialogue. One of the key ways to prevent the spread of hatred and extremism is through educating future generations about the atrocities committed under Hitler's regime. Holocaust education, which teaches not only the historical facts but also the moral and ethical lessons of that dark time, is essential to ensuring that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. It's not just about remembering the victims of the Holocaust. It's about understanding the mechanisms that allowed such hatred to flourish in the first place. Equally important is the ongoing fight against Holocaust denial and revisionism. While the overwhelming evidence of the Holocaust is irrefutable, there are still those who seek to minimize or outright deny the atrocities that took place. These revisionists often exploit gaps in knowledge, particularly among younger generations who may not have had access to first-hand accounts from survivors. Countering Holocaust denial is not just about defending the facts, it's about defending the truth itself, ensuring that future generations understand the horrors of the past and are equipped to recognize and resist the forces of hatred that seek to revive these dangerous ideologies. In Germany, the process of reckoning with the past continues to this day. Modern Germany has worked tirelessly to confront its Nazi past, not only through memorials, museums, and educational programs, but also through a robust commitment to human rights and social justice. Germany's experience is a model for other nations, showing that it is possible to rebuild after such a profound moral catastrophe, though it takes time, commitment, and a deep, ongoing reflection on the lessons of the past. However, the global struggle against extremism is not confined to any one country. While Germany has made significant strides, the lessons of the Holocaust and the dangers of Nazi ideology apply to all nations. Today, the fight for democracy, tolerance, and human dignity is an international struggle. The rise of white supremacist groups, anti-immigrant movements, and authoritarian leaders across the globe should serve as a reminder that the forces of extremism are never fully eradicated. They are always lurking, waiting for the right moment to exploit fear and division. The true test of our collective resolve is how we respond to these challenges. The memory of Hitler's regime should serve as a constant reminder that we must remain vigilant against the forces of hatred, racism, and authoritarianism. The fight for a just and peaceful world is ongoing, and it is a fight that requires the participation of each and every one of us. We must not become complacent or passive in the face of rising extremism. Instead, we must take a stand, whether by speaking out against injustice, promoting tolerance, or standing in solidarity with marginalized communities. As we reflect on Hitler's life, we must remember that history does not end with the fall of a dictator or the collapse of an empire. It is a continuous process, shaped by the actions and decisions of individuals and societies. The legacy of Hitler's rule is not something that can be confined to textbooks or history museums. It is something that lives on in the choices we make today, in the values we uphold, and in the fight for a future built on justice, equality, and human dignity. The task is not just to remember the atrocities of the past. It is to ensure that the world never again descends into the darkness that Hitler unleashed. The lessons of the Holocaust are a call to action for us all, a reminder of the dangers of complacency, the power of hate, and the fragility of democracy. In remembering the past, we honor the victims. In acting for the future, we ensure that their suffering was not in vain.